Like elegy, pastoral is one of the great shaping forms of poetry. If elegy is a melancholy mode, a poetic mode that meditates on the passing of time, the pain of the passing of time, in particular on death. What's the meaning of death? What's the meaning of loss? Then pastoral inhabits an opposing realm. The pastoral poem celebrates the organic world, celebrates life, vitality. In particular, the pastoral poem celebrates what we generally call nature, nature with a big N, nature as opposed to city, nature as opposed to the urban. Now, there are many different permutations of the pastoral mode in poetry, ranging from outright idealization of the natural world to more rigorous, realistic exploration of what it feels like to live in nature that's not idealized, post-Darwinian nature, if you will. But I think that there are some general characteristics that run through the pastoral mode, which begins, by the way, as far back as 700 BCE and continues to this day. When poets write nature poetry, say someone like Mary Oliver, they are usually nodding to the pastoral tradition, the idea that we can find in nature something that we cannot find in the city. Healing powers, powers of freedom, powers of life that the city stifles, oppresses, regularizes. So, pastoral poetry in general, as I said, draws a line between city life and country life, urban life, rural life, put it however you will. And generally in the pastoral poem, at least in its older versions, and when I say that, the ancient Greek and Roman versions and the early modern versions in English, generally the natural world in the pastoral is idealized, meaning that it's not a world that we can really recognize. In this idealized pastoral world, we see shepherds who speak as if they've been to Oxford and Cambridge. And we see a world where there really is no suffering, no strife. If there is labor, it's done with enjoyment. In other words, a world that doesn't really exist, but a world of fantasy, a world that fulfills our wish for harmony, or a world that fulfills our wish for freedom. So that's the one thing to get, that first and foremost, pastoral is an idealization of the natural world. And in this regard, the pastoral often explores imagined realms such as Arcadia or Eden. By the time we get to the early modern age, with poets like Spenser and Marlowe and Sidney and Raleigh and even Shakespeare, anytime the pastoral mode appears, there's almost always a nod to the Garden of Eden, a site of very desirable pastoral living, until, of course, Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and are ousted from their pastoral fantasy east of Eden. So, what happens in this romanticized or idealized realm? Things that a person cannot do in the city. Often there is an erotic element to the pastoral. The idea being that one can practice love more freely and more openly, more naturally in this idealized landscape, and enjoy a kind of intimacy that one cannot find in the city, which is ruled by conventions and rules and mores. Also, in this idealized landscape, often there is occasion to philosophize. Being away from the hustle and bustle of the city, being away from the exhausting hours of daily labor, one can sit around and meditate on the meaning of life. What is the good life? what is the beautiful life? What is the true life? So, idealized landscape invites erotic pleasure, invites philosophical speculation, and also the pastoral landscape invites just a general kind of freedom of living. What would be called loafing in the city is just seen as appropriate relaxation in the country. What might be seen as laziness in the city might be seen again as just what one does. Idleness is no problem out in the country, in the pastoral country, because there's really nothing to get worked up about. So we can easily see how this idealized landscape that shows in pastoral can cut both ways. On the one hand, it can be a mode that is highly critical of city life, basically saying that those who live in the city are greedy, materialistic, essentially making themselves miserable because they're so short-sighted. And furthermore, the pastoral can have a political bite to it as well. If the pastoral is written during a time of great civil strife, a time of war, a time of poverty, a time of hunger, then the idea that there is another way to exist outside of the city can carry with it, again, a kind of very critical impulse. But at the same time, and this is the other direction the pastoral can cut, the pastoral can also be seen as escapist, a flight from realism, a craven refusal to face what's really going on in the world. So in this regard, the pastoral can be seen as a reverie or a dream, some sort of escapist fantasy. So that's the basic shape of the pastoral, mainly as it appears in more traditional pastoral poetry. Again, the pastoral begins more or less in what we call the Western tradition in Hesiod, Works and Days, 700 BCE, where he talks about these various ages of man. There's a gold age, a silver age, bronze age, and so on. In the golden age, humans lived in harmony with the natural world. There was no strife. It was a kind of paradise, an earthly paradise that, again, might remind those of us who know something about the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Garden of Eden. Well, by the time we move to 300 BCE, a primary definer of the pastoral poetry is a poet named Theocritus. And Theocritus and his Idylls, Idylls, features shepherds and shepherdesses existing out in the country, falling in love, philosophizing, working, but not working in a way that's overly taxing. Again, a kind of quintessential romanticized view of the natural world. And then around 100 BCE, in that century, from 100 BC to 0 BCE, thereabouts, falling in there, is Virgil and his eclogues. Also are very much about the rhythms of rural life, the rural life ultimately being a place where one can experience pleasures one can't find in the city, and also being a place where one can criticize the excesses of the city. Now, the early modern period in England, what we still sometimes call the Renaissance period, we see a renaissance of these pastoral forms. The Roman pastoral of a Virgil, Horace, I should say, whom we know from our study of odes. Horace also wrote pastoral poetry in his odes and epistles. Reviving the ancient Greek pastoral, the ancient Roman pastoral, were poets like Christopher Marlowe, who in our anthology writes a famous pastoral poem, a very brief pastoral lyric called "The Passionate Shepherd to His Love." And it's a lovely poem written in quatrains, iambic tetrameter quatrains, A, B, B. And the opening alone is so charming, isn't it? Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that valleys, groves, hills, and fields, woods, or steepy mountain yields. And the shepherd is basically saying, hey, my beloved, come out here with me to the country and we'll do all this amazing stuff. We'll play with flowers, we'll spin beautiful clothing out of wool, and we'll be perfectly happy, like Adam and Eve before they fell, basically. And interestingly, Sir Walter Raleigh wrote a rejoinder to this poem, the Marlowe poem from 1599. Sorry. And 1 year later, Sir Walter Raleigh writes the nymph's reply to the shepherd, and she gives a very realistic reply to the shepherd, saying, "Yeah, your invitation to me to come out and be your love is all well and good, but we have to work pretty hard out here in the natural world to find food and to make clothing, and it gets pretty cold out here too." So it's a realistic rejoinder to the idealized landscape that Marlowe describes. So I bring this up to say that this will be one of the great clashes of pastoral when we move out of the early modern period up into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when the Industrial Revolution is coming about. And pastoral poets like Wordsworth are struggling mightily to deal with the realistic fact that nature is going away because of industry, and what happens to the pastoral then. So other examples of the pastoral mode from the early modern period, Edmund Spenser, The Shepherd's Calendar, Sir Philip Sidney, Arcadia, a prose work, but one that draws heavily on this pastoral tradition. And another poem that shows up in our anthology, the great poem from the later 17th century, The Garden by Andrew Marvell. And this poem is interesting. Marvell talks about how wonderful it is to live in a garden, how beautiful a garden is, and how it can lead to a life of carefree contemplation. How also, and this is an interesting take, how the garden allows him to retreat from romantic love. This seems that this speaker has had bad luck in romantic love, so he wants to get away from it by retreating into the garden. And ultimately, what Marvell suggests is that the true garden is not outside, but in the mind. And there's a beautiful stanza here, again from The Garden, 1681, Andrew Marvell. Meanwhile, while I'm sitting in the garden enjoying all the beauty, Meanwhile, from pleasure less withdraws into its happiness the mind. That ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Love those lines. Basically, Marvell is saying that the mind can come alive in a garden and realize that every thought that appears in the mind finds a manifestation outside of the mind. So if I think of an apple, then there's an apple outside to match my mental apple. But more, the mind can also create its own forms that transcend what it actually perceives with the five senses. Mind can imagine worlds that don't actually exist, far other worlds and other seas. And this is the great moment, annihilating all that's made to a green thought and a green shade. In other words, my mind is strong enough to shape my environment into what I want it to be, so that if I want to imagine the world as a green thought and a green shade, if I want to imagine the world as a garden, my mind has the power to do that. So wherever I am, mentally, I can live in a garden. So there's a shift here from the mind as a passive receptacle of sensory data to the mind as a shaping force of sensory data. Now I bring this up, again, preparing for Wordsworth, who will have a similar idea of mind. The idea being that the true pastoral landscape may not be outside, but inside. That the way I think about the world might be able to provide for me the virtues traditionally that the pastoral landscape has provided. So I'm moving up to the poem by Wordsworth, To My Sister, that I'm going to look at in a little more detail. Again, we know the general shape of the pastoral mode, But there were two variations I pointed out. One from Sir Walter Raleigh, where he criticizes the idealizations of Marlowe by bringing some realism into the pastoral. That's important for thinking about Wordsworth. And two, the idea that the mind itself might be able to achieve a kind of pastoral state regardless of the external environment. So in 1798, Wordsworth writes this poem to my sister. His sister's named Dorothy. They had a very close relationship. And Wordsworth, along with Coleridge and his wife Sarah, were living in the Quantock Mountain Range, Somerset, in 1798. And they were writing all these poems that were very alert to the natural world in ways that poems had not been alert to the natural world. What I mean by that is the poets valued the natural landscape just like a Marlowe did or Marvell did, but they tried to describe it with an acute attention to particularity. And not only that, there was a sense in Wordsworth and his friends that in the natural world, one can forge friendships and romantic relationships that are more powerful than the ones that you can find in the city. And also in the natural world, you can enjoy feeling that you can't enjoy in the city. In the city, you're asked to be rational and logical, whereas out in the natural world, you can feel a kind of idleness that breeds a sort of feeling. So for Wordsworth, the pastoral is a place of healing. Nature is a place of healing, but there's a psychological aspect in Wordsworth that we don't really see before. The idea being, what kinds of feelings can I have in nature that I can't have in the city? And what do these feelings do for me? What do they connect me to that I can't connect to in the city? Well, they connect me to forces in the natural world that aren't as apparent in the city, and they connect me to feelings of love that aren't as apparent in the city. So to my sister, it's a very casual, offhand sort of poem, and it describes basically we're just hanging out in the natural world. And this is another beautiful thing about Wordsworth's poetry. Is nature poetry it often feels occasional, casual, everyday, like, hey, just hanging out and taking a walk during the day is enough. I don't need to have some kind of grand romantic conceit. I don't need to philosophize in a major way. He says, to my sister, 1798, it's the first mild day of March, each minute sweeter than before. The redbreast sings from the tall larch that stands beside our door. Hear that beautiful ballad stanza that we know so well now? Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798 published a famous book called Lyrical Ballads, in which we see this poem, three other poems like it, lines written in early spring, the tables turned, and an expostulation and reply. This book also contains Wordsworth's great nature poem, Tintern Abbey. It also contains Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But we see this ballad form here that we know so well, right? The quatrain that alternates between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter with the rhyme scheme. Here it's A, B, A, B. Kind of variation on, usually we see the A, B, C, B, but here we have A, B, A, B. And it reads so easily and jauntily, it doesn't even feel like a poem in some ways, aside from the rhyme. It's the first mild day of March, each minute sweeter than before. The redbreast sings from the tall larch that stands beside our door. There's a blessing in the air, which seems a sense of joy to yield to the bare trees and mountains bare and grass in the green field. There's something going on here. There's a door, there's a larch beside the door, there's a robin nearby. The air feels nice, like there's a blessing in it. It seems like there's a joy in the air. And look at the bare trees. It's winter, the mountains, the grass. It's just ordinary. But notice that Wordsworth attributes to the natural world qualities that are true of humans. The air can't really feel blessing. The air can't really feel joy. But Wordsworth feels these emotions so profoundly by experiencing just the air that he attributes these emotions to the air. My sister, he says, apostrophe, my sister, Dorothy, very close to one another. Dorothy, a great writer too, nature writer in her journals, notebooks. My sister, 'tis a wish of mine. Now that our morning meal is done, make haste, your morning task resign. Come forth and feel the sun. Come out for the walk with me. Edward will come with you. This is what Wordsworth's calling himself in the poem. Edward will come with you, and pray, put on with speed your woodland dress, and bring no book, for this one day we'll give to idleness. Now, Wordsworth in these 1798 poems about nature is always saying nature's a place where we can be idle. And for Wordsworth, that's not being lazy, it's escaping the rules and authority of tradition. Instead of reading a book, which won't allow you to experience the air and the robin, because you'll be looking at words, instead of reading a book, put the book aside and just be passive. He calls this wise passiveness. And just let come what may and take it in. No joyless forms shall regulate our living calendar. We from today, my friend, will date the opening of the year. The opening of the year is not necessarily January 1st. It's now. Every day is the first day of the year. Every day we choose to experience the natural world in this immediate way. It's like the first day ever, the first day of life. There's an innocence and an immediacy to every single day. Love, now a universal birth, from heart to heart is stealing, from earth to man, from man to earth. It is the hour of feeling. Now there it is. So for Wordsworth, if there is such a thing as pastoral, and there is, that nature is more conducive to strong feeling than the city. That's what's most important to get from Wordsworth in this poem in particular. One moment now may give us more than years of toiling reason. Our minds shall drink at every pore the spirit of the season. Some silent laws our heart will make, which they will long obey. We for the year to come may take our temper from today. And from the blessed power that rolls about, below, above, will frame the measure of our souls that shall be tuned to love. Then come, my sister, come, I pray, with speed put on your woodland dress, and bring no book, for this one day will give to idleness. So we move from this very ordinary, let's go take a walk, to the sense that in this walk is an opportunity for intense feeling, to this grander conception that now the air that I called blessed earlier, now it feels like a power. And the air itself feels like a power that rolls everywhere, about, below, above. So there's a sense here that Wordsworth is secularizing spirit, what Christians would call spirit, an invisible power that animates all things. Wordsworth is saying that the air is essentially spirit. We don't need to read the Bible. We don't need to go to church. We can just breathe in nature, and that gives us all the spirit we will ever need. So the joy of everydayness, the pleasure in the ordinary, this is Wordsworth. And these pleasures and these joys are heightened in the natural world. Now, if I had more time, I would talk a little bit about the biographical context of this poem. Wordsworth had not long before been in France around the time of the Revolution and around the time of Robespierre's reign of terror. So Wordsworth had seen some terrible things. Furthermore, Wordsworth had a mistress, Annette Villon, that he had to leave behind in France, with whom he had a child. So this was a man who had seen a lot of pain, a lot of terror, experienced a lot of pain. So we can see that he really does cast the natural world as a realm of healing. There's a therapeutic quality to the natural world that one can't find in the urban world. So certainly a lot of poets after Wordsworth were writing poems in this mode, Mary Oliver in particular, and we'll look at some of those poems this week. But what we can get here is that if we go from Theocritus, well, really from Hesiod all the way up to Wordsworth, there's a kind of move, an increasingly psychological aspect to the pastoral. The pastoral moving from a space that one can imagine inhabiting, an Arcadia, an Eden, to a mental state that one can cultivate from the inside. The idea being that the pastoral doesn't need to be out there, but the true pastoral can be in here.